Layla.
Welcome back to our channel, Elementary My Dear,
Where we make nutrition science easy for you to digest.
Today we're talking about if creatine can make you smarter.
Be sure to hit that subscribe button so you never miss one of our videos. Last week we talked about creatine. We talked about how it's getting a lot of attention, a lot of buzz, a lot of hype in the gym community. But recently it's getting a lot of buzz somewhere a little bit unexpected, at least for me. Creatine has been increasingly popular for people claiming it has an effect on cognition, on brain health. If you take creatine, you're gonna be sharper, you're gonna be better, be less tired and do your job better, which is kind of interesting because this supplement that's been so popular in the gym community for making you strong, improving your lean muscle mass, is now being thought of for something that's almost seen as like the opposite, brains versus brawn. We know it works for brawn, but does it work for your brains?
If you missed our last video on the effects of creatine on strength and performance, definitely check that out. But a very quick recap, creatine is a naturally occurring compound, and one of its main functions is actually to regenerate the primary source of energy in our bodies, which is adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. We get energy from ATP because it has 3 phosphate groups, and it goes through a hydrolysis process where it loses a phosphate group. When that phosphate group comes off, it releases energy, and that energy our bodies are able to use. Now, what we're left with is adenosine diphosphate, which only has 2 phosphate groups. This is where creatine comes in. Creatine can be bound to a phosphate group in and of itself in the form of phosphocreatine, and this compound will give its phosphate group to adenosine diphosphate to again become adenosine triphosphate. It can again go through that hydrolysis process and give us energy.
Theoretically, the more creatine you have, the more phosphocreatine you have, and the more ATP you can recycle and make more energy.
This type of energy production is actually really great for quick, short bursts of energy, which is why creatine is abundantly found in our muscle tissue and is likely what's contributing to the positive effects that we see in strength and performance. All that being said, you might be wondering, well, what does this have to do with cognitive health? How can it possibly help improve our attention or our memory? The reason that this line of inquiry even came about is because there are some genetic creatine defects that have been associated with mental dysfunction. And in a couple of these types of disorders, it was found that creatine supplementation actually helps alleviate those symptoms.
Just like your muscles are using ATP for energy, so is your brain. Your brain actually uses a lot of energy. Your brain is actually only 2% of your body weight, but it uses 20% of the energy in your body. So the thought is, if you have more creatine, you're gonna have more phosphocreatine in your brain, and your brain is gonna be able to make more energy. And then it can use that for cognitive processes and thinking and all the stuff that your brain does.
You might be wondering what the term cognition even means. Cognition is basically a very broad umbrella term that encompasses all the mental processes that are involved in either acquiring knowledge or understanding, whether through thought or experience. It includes things like thinking and knowing and judging and remembering and problem solving. Now, when you hear that, you can probably tell that that's a lot of things, and it's a lot of abstract things. So as you can imagine, it's actually kind of difficult to measure. When it comes to, in the scientific space, there are some validated tests that are around to evaluate certain measures of cognition. But, we're talking about tests like, for example, one that comes to mind is a test called Serial 7s or Subtract 7, where participants are started off with a random number, and they basically have to continually subtract 7, and the goal is to do that as accurately and quickly as possible. So that's super interesting stuff, but how relevant or applicable is that to real life and the things that we do day to day?
Especially when you consider most of the studies that are looking at cognition, you're like in an all-white lab and it's quiet and all your mental energy is going into subtracting 7, which definitely tells us about your ability to subtract 7 in a all-white laboratory with no sounds and no one around. But in day-to-day life, it's very rare that you're going to be in a situation where all of your cognitive capacity is on one thing. How well do these tests translate into real life? So to do all these cognitive processes requires energy from your brain. And this is kind of where the thought of perhaps creatine supplementation could lead to improvements in cognition comes from.
That I think the next logical question is, well, does creatine supplementation actually improve cognition? This is a weird area of research, and there is limited research. In 2018, there was a systematic review that looked at the effects of creatine supplementation on various areas of cognition on healthy people. Now, they looked at a whole bunch of different studies, but it was actually difficult to kind of reach any sort of conclusion because there was a lot of variation between how the different studies were conducted. They were looking at different areas of cognition. The specific tests that were used to evaluate those areas of cognition were different. And it also seemed like there was quite a high risk of bias in a lot of these studies. What that means is, when it comes to designing a research study, sometimes the way you frame a question or the way you do the testing, whether the participants are blinded or how they are randomized or assigned to different treatments or whether the researcher is blinded, all of those things can lead to possibly misleading results. And this may or may not be intentional or done with malice. There are objective ways to kind of evaluate the risk of bias in different research studies, and it does seem like a lot of these particular studies did have a high risk of bias.
Not only that, the type of supplementation was super different in all of these studies. Most of them used creatine monohydrate, which is kind of like the creatine that you would get when you go to a GNC. That's the most common form of creatine supplement. But in terms of the dose and how long, whether there was a loading phase or not, they were kind of all over the place. And so that kind of makes it hard to get to a definitive answer.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty. Now, talking specifically about short-term memory, the systematic review included 4 studies in their analysis, and out of the 4 studies, 3 of them did find benefit of creatine supplementation. However, one of them was reported to have high risk of bias, and one of them, the benefit was only seen in vegetarians and not in omnivores, which possibly suggests that perhaps we might see just more of a benefit in those that are predominantly plant-based eaters. And at the same time, we're talking about just a handful of studies, and it's really difficult to draw any large conclusion from this.
The one study that didn't find a difference was actually only included young people. That may lead us to maybe think that potentially the impacts of creatine supplementation on cognition may be better for older adults due to, some of the cognitive effects of aging. But again, this is like 4 studies, and they're not the best studies ever.
So now that was specifically for short-term memory, but when we're looking at other types of memory, whether it's spatial memory or running memory, they did look at several different studies, and none of them really seemed to show an effect of creatine supplementation.
Looking at other areas of cognition like executive functioning and
Attention.
There we go. See, this is the one thing I love. Maybe I need some creatine. Well, I guess not. But looking at other areas of cognition like executive function and attention, there wasn't really any effects found in any of the studies that they looked at.
They also looked at mathematical reasoning, and they found 3 studies on this topic, and 2 out of the 3 did find benefit. 1 out of the 3 did not find any benefit of creatine supplementation, but again, this study was done in only young people, which again suggests that perhaps there's less of a benefit for younger people, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's also true for other populations like older adults.
This result with mathematical reasoning, the thought there that is perhaps mathematical reasoning takes more out of your brain. It's a little bit more complex than some of these other areas of cognition, and so maybe it's causing your brain to need more energy. So potentially in these skills that require more cognitive function, having creatine has more of an effect. But again, it's only 2 studies, and again, they're not the best.
We've alluded a couple of times to the fact that, we haven't seen effects on cognition with creatine supplementation in the younger population, and that perhaps we would see improvements in older adults. Well, let's look at the research when it actually comes to that population. In 2020, there was a systematic review of randomized controlled trials looking at the effect of both creatine supplementation and exercise on cognition in older adults, and they compared that with exercise and a placebo. And unfortunately, there was no significant difference between the 2 groups.
The good news is exercise is really great for cognition for everyone, and especially older adults. So, if you're looking for something as an older adult to help you with cognition, exercise is great.
Absolutely. I think that physical activity is kind of one of the things there's quite a bit of evidence to show that it helps with preventing cognitive decline, or slowing cognitive decline, I should say.
If you can't turn to creatine, exercise will definitely do it, and has a plethora of other benefits as well.
So I think the next logical question is, in that case, does consuming more creatine or taking creatine supplementation, does that actually increase the amount of creatine in the brain? It's actually thought that maybe the dietary intake of creatine may not have as much of an impact on the amount of creatine in the brain. And this is in contrast to what we find in serum levels of creatine or levels of creatine in your muscle. When we're looking at the amount of creatine in your blood or in your muscles, we actually find that there is an impact of dietary intake. And the reason we know that is because it seems that vegetarians tend to have lower levels of creatine in those areas. However, when it comes to our brain, there doesn't actually seem to be a difference in creatine levels between vegetarians and omnivores.
And there's a few different reasons why this might be the case. The first thing is that your brain actually makes its own creatine. So your muscles, they don't make their own creatine. They have to either get it from the creatine you're eating in your diet, creatine you're supplementing, or the creatine that's being made in your kidneys and your liver. But your brain can make it all by itself. Some scientists actually think that the reason we're not seeing this big increase in the amount of creatine in your brain with creatine supplementation may actually be because your brain's like, oh, we have so much creatine. Let me relax a little bit on this creatine production.
Another possible explanation put forth by scientists is that perhaps the creatine that you're consuming through supplement forms, maybe it's just not crossing the blood-brain barrier in an effective way.
Maybe creatine's not on the brain guest list. It can't make it into the club. You know, we've been talking a lot about cognition, which is an indicator of brain health. But when we're talking about creatine and brain health, there is some early evidence to suggest that in people who have issues making creatine in their brain, whether that be because of a genetic abnormality or perhaps something like depression or certain neurological disorders, as well as something like a traumatic brain injury, creatine may actually be beneficial for brain health and symptomology in those conditions. But really, it's very early days.
And we can't talk about brain health without talking about mental health. Very early research has kind of made some connections between depression and creatine. For example, observational research has found that those with higher levels of creatine seem to have lower risk for depression. This kind of aligns with another observation that we've made, which is that those that are vegan seem to be at higher risk of depression. And we talked about before how plant-based eaters may just have lower levels of creatine in their bodies. However, at the same time, we don't know if, this connection, is there a causal relationship between creatine and depression, or is this just a confounding variable and perhaps there are other dietary or lifestyle variables that are contributing to that. That being said, very, very early research in humans and specifically experiments are showing promise that creatine supplementation may help with depression. For example, there was one randomized control trial that looked at 50 plus women with depression. They were either given SSRIs, which is a common treatment for depression, as well as creatine, or just SSRIs and a placebo. And they actually found that the combination of creatine and the SSRIs actually improved depression scores more than just the SSRIs with the placebo.
And this is a really interesting line of research, and it's going to be interesting to see where this goes in the future. So you kind of might be wondering, should I be taking creatine to help my cognition? You gotta give us some results, and they were kind of mixed everywhere. And honestly, given the strength of the evidence right now, I would say if you're taking creatine only to improve cognition, probably not the best strategy, and there's probably a lot of other things you can do. If you were taking creatine, let's say for helping with muscle strength and lean muscle mass, and also hoping to improve cognition, sure, but really there's not enough evidence right now for cognition. And the good thing is creatine is very, very safe, even in really high doses. But what you buy from the store is very different than what they're using in a lot of these clinical trials. And a lot of creatine supplements, especially because they're marketed to like bodybuilders and people who are really trying to get strong, may actually contain other harmful substances. So you might actually be doing yourself a disservice for cognition or other aspects of health if you're buying these supplements that may be adulterated to improve your cognition.
Thank you so much for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a video, and follow us on Instagram and TikTok.
Thanks for watching. Bye.